Should private car be banned from city centres to encourage public transport and walking?
Private cars are one of the biggest contributors to air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, especially in large cities such as Lima, the capital of Peru. According to El Comercio, reducing the number of private cars can significantly improve air quality, lead to substantially lower carbon emissions, and reduce the carbon footprint of urban areas. Environmental experts argue that this is such an important measure because it would not only benefit the environment but could also improve public health. Poor air quality is associated with respiratory diseases such as asthma, particularly among children. According to Peru's National Hospital, the number of children affected by air pollution has increased over the last 5 years. In fact, around 20% of children suffer from asthma or other respiratory conditions related to poor air quality. Therefore, reducing car use could create cleaner cities and contribute to a significantly better quality of life for local residents. When city centers become more pedestrian-friendly, people are more likely to walk or cycle instead of relying on private cars. According to a report by Stanford University, cities whose governments adopt policies supporting active transport and invest in infrastructure such as a bike lane network experience significantly higher levels of daily physical activity. Health specialists hold the view that getting enough regular exercise is one of the most effective ways to reduce the risk of developing obesity, cardiovascular disease, and mental health problems. This is such a relevant argument because physical inactivity has become a significant public health concern. According to Peru's Ministry of Health, more than 35% of adults fail to meet the recommended levels of physical activity. Investing in active transport could help reverse this trend while encouraging people to spend more time outdoors, which has been linked to substantially lower stress levels and better mental well-being. While critics might argue that redesigning city centers is too expensive or demanding, the evidence suggests that promoting active transport could bring considerable long-term benefits to public health. Reducing the number of private vehicles can make urban areas considerably safer and more pleasant for local residents. According to architect Russell Todoroff, poorly planned urban development can negatively affect people's quality of life, particularly when cities do not have enough parking spaces and residents spend too many hours dealing with traffic congestion. By restricting vehicles in urban centers, cities could reduce this daily frustration and replace stressful, gridlocked commutes with more efficient transport networks. When buses, trams, and trains do not have to share the road with thousands of private cars, public transport can potentially become faster and more reliable. To make this a reality, however, local governments must invest enough public resources in upgrading transport infrastructure and ensuring that services operate frequently and efficiently. Recent findings reported by BBC News indicate that cities with stricter traffic restrictions tend to allocate considerably more funding to sustainable transport projects. Transport specialists explain that these investments can benefit the entire population, particularly people who cannot afford to own a car.
Many cities still lack reliable, affordable, and efficient public transport systems. A recent report by Reuters highlights that millions of commuters continue to rely on private vehicles because buses and trains are often overcrowded or delayed. This is such a serious problem because, without a viable alternative, banning cars does not necessarily solve the mobility issue. Instead, it could simply shift the burden onto people who have no other way to get to work, school, or medical appointments. Transport experts argue that public transport networks in many developing cities were never designed to absorb the sudden increase in demand that a car ban would create. As a result, waiting times could become too long, while buses and trains could become so overcrowded that the quality of the service would deteriorate even further. Therefore, governments should upgrade public transport before banning private cars. Infrastructure and service quality need to be improved enough to ensure that people have a reliable alternative before the current means of transportation is taken away. A complete ban on private cars would not affect everyone in the same way. An article published by the New York Times highlights that certain groups depend far more heavily on private transport than others, making a blanket ban a disproportionate burden rather than an equal sacrifice. Healthcare professionals and social policy experts explain that older adults, people with disabilities, parents of young children, and emergency workers often require the flexibility of private vehicles. They may need cars to reach medical appointments quickly, transport children safely, or respond to emergencies without delay. For these groups, a car is not simply a luxury but an important tool for independence and safety. The situation could become so difficult for people with limited mobility that a complete ban would seriously restrict their independence. Critics also point out that low-income families living on the outskirts of cities could be affected particularly severely because public transport is often not reliable enough in these areas. They may also have fewer financial resources to adapt to alternative forms of transport. For this reason, governments should introduce targeted exceptions and support measures rather than imposing such a rigid policy that fails to take people's different needs into account. Banning private cars can have a serious economic impact, particularly on small businesses. According to the National Chamber of Commerce of Peru, restricting private vehicles can significantly affect business income. One of the main reasons is that consumers often prefer using their own vehicles to transport purchases, particularly in the retail and food service sectors. This could become such a significant problem that some small businesses might experience a substantial decline in sales. If customers cannot find enough parking spaces near shops and restaurants, they may simply choose to visit businesses in more accessible areas. Furthermore, ride-hailing drivers who use apps such as Uber could be seriously affected because they depend on private vehicles for their livelihoods, while legislation may not establish appropriate exceptions for them. Overall, a complete ban could affect a significant proportion of people who own private vehicles and depend on them for work or everyday activities. The economic consequences could therefore be too serious to ignore. Instead of introducing an immediate ban, governments should consider a gradual transition supported by better public transport, adequate infrastructure, and carefully planned urban development.